Ned Stark didn't die because he was too honourable. He died because he made a cold, calculated bet on the wrong man's soul. And that one sentence is going to change how you watch his entire arc, because everyone tells you the same tired story. They say Ned was a good man in a bad city, a wolf who wandered into a den of snakes and got eaten because he refused to play the game. That's the fan fiction version. It's comforting. It's also wrong, or at least incomplete, and once you see what was actually happening in his head during those final weeks in King's Landing, you'll never read those chapters the same way again. Here's the real story. Ned Stark ran the numbers. He looked at Petyr Baelish, weighed every piece of evidence he had, and made a decision that felt logical to him in the moment. It wasn't blind trust. It was a bet, built on a foundation that seemed solid, and it collapsed underneath him at the worst possible second. So let's actually pull apart what was going on inside his head, piece by piece, because George R.R. Martin buried the clues in plain sight, and the show, for all the shortcuts it took, kept the bones of that psychology mostly intact. Let's set the stage first, because context is everything here. Ned Stark comes to King's Landing already carrying grief. His mentor Jon Arryn is dead, and Ned has been dragged south to take his place as Hand of the King, a job he never wanted and openly dreaded. He's a northerner in a southern court, a man who values plain speech in a place built entirely on lies, dressed up as compliments. And almost immediately he starts pulling on threads that Jon Arryn had already started pulling. The question of Robert's heirs, the strange blonde hair on children who should have inherited the Baratheon look, the whispered line about seeds being strong, a clue that eventually cracks the whole rotten secret wide open. Cersei's children aren't Robert's at all. They belong to her twin brother, Jaime. That discovery is the engine of everything that follows. Once Ned knows the truth about Joffrey, Tommen and Myrcella, he's holding a weapon that could reshape the succession of the entire Seven Kingdoms. And the person standing next to him through most of this unravelling, offering advice, offering contacts, offering a friendly shoulder in a court full of knives, is Petyr Baelish. Now here's where we need to slow down and actually get inside Ned's reasoning, because this is where most breakdowns of this storyline get lazy. Ned didn't trust Petyr Baelish because he liked the man. Ned finds Littlefinger's manner grating almost from the first page, the way George Martin writes it. Ned describes him internally as a man he trusts less than almost anyone at court. So why does he still lean on him? Because of Catelyn. Petyr Baelish was fostered at Riverrun as a boy, raised alongside Catelyn Tully and her siblings. He fell in love with her, hard, the kind of adolescent devotion that never really lets go of a person. When Brandon Stark, Ned's older brother, came to formally claim Catelyn's hand, Petyr challenged him to a duel over it and nearly died for his trouble. Brandon spared him, scarred him, and sent him home. That single event defines Littlefinger's entire relationship with House Stark and House Tully for the rest of his life, and Ned knows this history intimately. It's not a rumour to him, it's family history. So when Ned arrives in King's Landing and finds Petyr Baelish sitting on the small council, his brain does something very human and very dangerous. He files Littlefinger under connected to Catelyn, rather than under political operator with his own agenda. He treats him less like a rival lord scheming for position, and more like an awkward younger brother figure, someone who carries an old torch for his wife, and who, because of that old devotion, must surely wish the Starks well. Ned even leans on this explicitly, asking Petyr directly to help Catelyn when she comes to the capital in secret, and Petyr does help her, at least on the surface, arranging safe passage and quiet meetings. That earns him a credit in Ned's mental ledger that never gets fully spent down. This is the first crack in the logic, and it's an understandable one. Ned assumes that loyalty to a person automatically becomes loyalty to a cause. He assumes Petyr's fondness for Catelyn extends naturally to her husband and her family's political interests, but love for a woman who chose someone else, held onto for over a decade, curdled by rejection and humiliation, doesn't always turn into loyalty. Sometimes it turns into something closer to resentment dressed up as devotion. Ned never seriously considers that version of Petyr Baelish, because it would mean questioning the one piece of southern support he actually believed he could count on. Once Ned uncovers the truth about Joffrey's parentage, he's faced with a set of brutal choices, and this is where his internal calculus becomes genuinely fascinating, because it's not simple naivety driving him. It's a very specific, very deliberate prioritization. Stannis Baratheon, Robert's younger brother, is the legal heir by every rule of succession once Joffrey is exposed as a bastard born of incest. Renly, the youngest Baratheon brother, doesn't care much for legal technicalities. Renly comes to Ned in the dead of night with an offer. Strike now, while Robert is still out on that hunt and hasn't even made it back to the Red Keep yet, and sees Cersei and her children using nothing but Renly's own household guard, roughly 100 swords, before anyone else has time to organise a defence. It's ruthless, it's fast, and honestly, it might have worked. Ned refuses, and this is the moment people love to call proof of his fatal honour, but look closer at what he actually says in his internal reasoning throughout these chapters. Ned isn't just refusing because striking first feels dishonourable in the abstract. He's doing mental math about his daughters. Sansa is betrothed to Joffrey and living inside the Red Keep, essentially a hostage in silk clothing, whether anyone calls her that or not. Arya is younger, more vulnerable, harder to track through a chaotic city if violence erupts without warning. If Ned backs a sudden coup and it goes wrong, or even if it goes right but triggers chaos in the capital, his daughters are the ones standing in the blast radius. He is not thinking like a man defending an abstract principle of honour for its own sake. He is thinking like a father calculating the safest extraction route for his children, and in his mind, a slower, more legitimate transfer of power to Stannis, backed by proper process and the City Watch under royal authority, feels like the version of events least likely to get Sansa or Arya killed in the crossfire. That's why the deal with the Gold Cloaks matters so much to him. Ned essentially treats his arrangement with Janos Slynt, commander of the City Watch, as a business transaction rather than a political alliance. Gold changes hands. Loyalty, in Ned's mind, has just been purchased the same way you'd purchase grain or steel. He doesn't fully grasp that in King's Landing, gold bought today can be outbid by more gold tomorrow, and that the man brokering the deal, Petyr Baelish, is the same man who controls the flow of coin and information running through the whole transaction. Here's the part of Ned's reasoning that's almost tragic in its logic, because on paper it isn't stupid. It's actually a fairly sound read of incentives, just applied to the wrong variable. Ned watches how the Crown's finances work. He learns, to his horror, just how deeply in debt the Iron Throne actually is, with staggering sums owed to the Lannisters directly, and additional debt owed to the Iron Bank of Braavos and other creditors across the Free Cities. And Petyr Baelish, as Master of Coin, is the man who has been juggling all of it, the man who understands exactly where every dragon of that debt sits and who it's owed to. Ned's internal logic goes something like this. Petyr Baelish is a man of low birth who has clawed his way into real power and real wealth. A man like that, Ned reasons, cares first and foremost about protecting what he's built. Chaos is bad for business. A stable, predictable, Stark-backed regency under Stannis would mean continuity, would mean Petyr keeps his position, keeps his income, keeps his brothels and his trade interests intact. Why would a man that invested in the current financial architecture of the realm want to blow it all up? Ned even goes a step further in his own head, and this is the part that really stings in hindsight. He interprets Petyr's open cynicism, his casual admissions that he'd sell secrets to whoever pays best, his blunt jokes about buying and selling loyalty like a commodity, as a kind of honesty. In a city where everyone smiles and lies to your face, Ned reads Littlefinger's shameless self-interest as refreshingly transparent. At least Baelish tells you he's for sale. At least you know where you stand with him. Ned genuinely believes he understands Petyr's price and has already paid it, through gold, through the old debt to Catelyn's memory, through the promise of continued position under a new regime. What Ned completely misreads is the scale of Petyr's actual ambition. He's thinking about Baelish as a man who wants to keep his current seat at the table. He never once considers that Baelish wants the whole table, the whole castle it sits in, and eventually the whole kingdom underneath it. Small-scale greed, the kind Ned can price out and negotiate with, is not the same animal as a man quietly plotting to climb from brothel keeper to Lord Protector of the Vale to eventually a seat far closer to the crown than anyone in King's Landing ever suspected. Now we get to the moment the title promises, the final conversation, the one that actually seals Ned's fate. Robert gets gored on that same hunt, and the wound turns fatal partly because Cersei's cousin Lancel kept pouring him wine far stronger than he should have been drinking. He's carried back to the Red Keep dying, and while he's still breathing, Ned makes his move. He confronts Cersei directly and warns her to take her children and flee the city before Robert actually dies, and Joffrey's claim to the throne becomes official. It's a mercy and a strategic misstep because it hands Cersei time to prepare rather than forcing her hand immediately. Robert never learns the truth about his children before he passes. Once he's gone, Ned acts on Robert's dying words, naming him Protector of the Realm, and orders Janos Slynt and the Gold Cloaks to back him in arresting Cersei and securing Stannis' claim. This is the moment Ned has been building toward through every piece of that earlier calculus. And it's also the moment it all falls apart because the Gold Cloaks don't answer to Ned's gold anymore. Littlefinger got there first, or perhaps he was always the one actually holding the leash. In the throne room, as chaos breaks out and Ned realises the guards are turning their spears on him rather than on Cersei, he looks for Petyr Baelish, the man he believed was his ally in this exact scenario. And Petyr steps up behind him, presses a blade to his throat, and delivers the line that has haunted fans for over a decade. A quiet, almost gentle reminder that he had told Ned, back when they first struck their arrangement, not to trust him. Sit with that for a second, because it's genuinely one of the more brutal character beats in the entire saga. Petyr Baelish isn't lying to Ned in that final moment. He's not even really gloating. He's simply confirming that the terms were always on the table, spoken out loud earlier in their dealings, and Ned chose to hear them as a joke, or as false modesty, or as the kind of self-deprecating honesty he'd already convinced himself was proof of trustworthiness. Ned's own read on Petyr's transparency becomes the very thing that damns him. He was told. He just didn't believe the warning applied to him. And that's the unspoken plea buried in that final look Ned gives him, right before the Gold Cloaks close in. It's not confusion. It's the horrified recognition that his entire strategy, the gold paid to Slynt, the goodwill banked with Petyr over years tied to Catelyn, the read on greed as a stabilising and predictable force, all of it was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what actually drives Petyr Baelish. Ned assumed Petyr's ambitions were shaped like his own, bounded by loyalty to people and institutions. What he failed to account for was the raw, class-shaped resentment simmering underneath Petyr's charm, the grudge of a lowborn boy who was beaten, scarred and humiliated by a Stark for daring to love a Tully, and who spent the rest of his life quietly, patiently, working toward a world where men like Brandon Stark and Ned Stark no longer got to hand out humiliations from a position of inherited privilege. Here's the part that really widens the lens, because Ned's death isn't just a personal tragedy. It's the hinge the entire War of the Five Kings swings on. With Ned dead, Robb Stark marches south for vengeance, dragging the North into open war and eventually into an alliance with House Frey that he desperately needs, and then critically mishandles by breaking his marriage pact with them. That broken promise becomes the pretext for the Red Wedding, arguably the single most devastating scene in the entire show, and one of the most shocking chapters Martin ever wrote, where Robb, Catelyn and much of the Stark military leadership are slaughtered under a banner of guest right. Trace that catastrophe back far enough and you land right back on this exact miscalculation in the throne room, the moment Ned bet his life and his family's future on Petyr Baelish being a man whose greed made him predictable. There's a genuinely useful lesson buried in here for anyone watching, and it has nothing to do with Westeros specifically. Ned's fatal error wasn't honour, it was projection. He looked at Petyr Baelish and assumed the man's motivations worked the way his own did, that self-interest could be reasoned with the same way loyalty could. That transparency about being for sale was the same thing as trustworthiness. It's a mistake plenty of smart, capable people make when dealing with someone who operates on a completely different value system than they do. You can out-negotiate a man who wants gold. You cannot out-negotiate a man who wants to burn down the entire structure that made you more powerful than him in the first place. That single misread reshaped the power map of Westeros for the next decade. Petyr Baelish used the chaos that followed to climb, quietly and patiently, from Master of Coin to Lord Protector of the Vale, positioning himself closer and closer to real power, while everyone else bled each other dry, fighting over a throne he never actually wanted for himself, at least not in the way anyone expected. Ned Stark handed him the opening without ever realising it, because he never stopped believing his own reading of the man was the correct one, right up until the knife was already at his throat. So the next time someone tells you Ned Stark died because he was too honest for King's Landing, you can push back on that a little. He died because he trusted his own analysis of a man's soul, made a calculated bet based on that analysis, and lost. Because the man on the other end of that bet was playing an entirely different game with entirely different stakes. If this kind of deep character breakdown is your thing, let me know in the comments which storyline you want picked apart next, because there are plenty of quiet, devastating moments buried in this saga that don't get nearly enough attention. And if you want more of these deep dives into the psychology behind the biggest moments in Westeros, subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from.